Last Sunday, the Chancellor ticked us off for being what he called negative and declinist about Britain. Well, this week, it's still pretty hard to find reasons to be cheerful. This morning, Daniel Khalif is back behind bars. But with crumbling jails, demoralised staff and spiralling sentences, how long before another prison break? The Prime Minister calls himself India's son-in-law. But is he bringing home anything more than just another family photo? Labour's got a new look. Union leaders reckon it's a bit like the old Blairite look. But do we have any idea what they would do in power? Alex Chalk has been Justice Secretary for less than 6 months. Today, he has to explain why a suspected terrorist was loose on the streets of London for 4 days on his watch. Rory Stewart was the prisons minister who said he'd resign if he couldn't make things better. He'll tell us if it's time for his successor to pack his bags. Jonathan Reynolds is Labour's shadow business secretary. He kept his job in last week's reshuffle. What's he going to do that the Tories won't? And Devi Sridhar was barely off our screens during the pandemic. The good news, she's back. The bad news, so is COVID. With us throughout the morning, 3 distinguished observers of the state of the nation, who all have very different ideas about what's blighting Britain. Andrew Marr, political editor of The New Statesman, Melanie Phillips, journalist and my fellow Times columnist, and Fraser Nelson, editor of The Spectator magazine. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Things fall apart, wrote the poet W.B. Yeats. Crumbling concrete, porous prisons, sewage in our streams, staff on the sick. And just when we thought it was safe to leave home, a new strain of COVID about to hit. Let's keep things in perspective. We aren't Morocco, where the news this morning is just grim. But the feeling that's sweeping the nation is that we're a country where nothing really works, and that the sticking plaster that's always held things in place is finally coming off. In a while, we'll talk to the Labour opposition. But first, the government remains adamant that it's getting the fundamentals right. A short time ago, I spoke to Alex Chalk, the Justice Secretary. Justice Secretary, over 2,000 people are dead in Morocco this morning. What help are we providing?
Well, it's an absolutely appalling situation, and we stand ready to provide whatever assistance is required. We have a strong record, whether it was in the Turkish appalling disaster that took place or others. We will do whatever we can. We have certain expertise in terms of search and rescue. We stand ready to do what we can. I know the Foreign Office are in close contact with our counterparts in that country.
And the Moroccans have said what they wanted yet?
Well, I think, as I say, this is a matter that the Foreign Office are leading on, but I've been absolutely assured that we stand ready to do whatever we can, and those contacts are in place.
There's another issue that has arisen this morning, which might indeed land up in your plate as Secretary of State for Justice. It's reported that Parliament has been infiltrated by a Chinese spy, or at least someone working for China who had a parliamentary pass. I know you can't say anything about the specific case, but there's an interesting point here. Parliamentary passes are pretty difficult to get. I don't have one. Is it time to review the allocation of these passes? Because this isn't the first time something like this has happened.
Well, I think firstly, we've got to take this in stages. You say it may end up on my desk. Obviously, there's a police investigation. It could be that independent prosecutors have to look at it, and we shouldn't say anything which could jeopardise those proceedings. But there is a rigorous approach that is taken in terms of being provided with passes. But plainly, this has got to play through in terms of this investigation, and whatever lessons need to be learnt by the parliamentary authorities, I'm sure will be learnt. But it is important to take it in stages.
Indeed, but you wouldn't rule out the possibility that there may be weaknesses in the system that we need to address.
I don't think you should rule anything out. Absolutely. And, the Prime Minister has been very clear when it comes to China. It's an epoch-defining threat, challenge, forgive me. So, of course, we've got to take it extremely seriously. And I know the police and no doubt other agencies will take it seriously as well, and let's learn whatever lessons need to be learned.
I won't pick you up too much on the Freudian slip of China being a threat, but I suspect that's what many in Parliament think.
Look, I mean, you can't wish China away. China is the world's second biggest economy. If we are going to meet the challenge of climate change, we can't do it without China. They're responsible for about 27, 28% of emissions. We're about 1%. So we have to engage, but we do so with our eyes open. And that's why we take steps like to ensure that Huawei is out of our 5G network, at the same time recognising there is a sensible engagement to have, and that's the position that we're in.
Do you know if Mr Cleverly raised the issue of China's spying, the Confucius Institutes, which they've set up, the use of students spying on other students, which we now know is true? Did Mr Cleverly raise this when he was in Beijing last week?
Well, I haven't had specific conversations with James Cleverly about that, but from speaking to him, and I sit around the cabinet table with him, James and indeed the whole British government, as I say, are very clear and very clear-eyed. We will raise matters with the Chinese that are of concern to us, along the lines potentially that you referred to, and that's fine. What you can't do, it seems to us, is to step back and say, world's second biggest economy, critical, by the way, to the lives and the livelihoods of people in our country, and have no engagement. So we think it's practical and pragmatic to do so, but to make sure we stand up for our values, that we assert the value of the rule of law, we assert the value of human rights, whilst ensuring that we have that sensible engagement, because the lives and livelihoods of our people can be dependent upon that relationship as well.
All right, let's turn to the story which has no doubt been occupying much of your time this week. You've commissioned, I think, 4 inquiries into the escape of Daniel Khalif. If he did have help from prison staff, we have no idea about that yet, or another prisoner, are you confident that the scope of the reviews that you have set out will reveal who and how he was helped?
Well, let me just step back for a second. First of all, I want to thank the police who've done an absolutely excellent job. Second, I think it is also important to stress that these are very, very rare incidents, but we take them extremely seriously, which is why I set up the inquiries that you referred to look into the circumstances of the apparent escape, but also issues about categorisation. And I asked for there to be preliminary findings on my desk by the end of the week. That's this week. And I am able to say, although, of course, we have to tread carefully because it may be that there are criminal proceedings in due course, but I am able to say that on the issue of whether there were protocols in place, that's to say protocols about when, after food has been unloaded from a van, that the proper head count takes place before you can call the control room, for example, protocols about whether there's a proper search apparatus to look underneath the vehicle. Those protocols were in place, point one. And point two, staff, the relevant security staff, were also in place. Now, plainly, what we have yet to establish is whether those protocols were followed, and that's what the investigation will take place. But one thing I do want to stress, if I just very quickly want to stress, is yes, we've got those thorough internal investigations, but I've also asked for an independent investigation as well, so that we can be absolutely satisfied that the conclusions that are drawn are rock solid.
You do understand how bizarre this seems, especially as you've just told me that there were enough staff, the staff who were supposed to be there, for example, at the airlock, that the vans pass in and out of, that the protocols were there. We don't know if they were observed, but it does seem utterly bizarre to the outside observer that this could have happened. I mean, if it wasn't so serious, it would be almost comic.
Well, it's extremely serious, and you know, that's why the moment it was brought to my attention, I wanted to speak to the governor, and I resolved that we should set up these inquiries. But as I say, these investigations...
And you're confident that the governor knows what, I think it's a she.
It's a she, yeah. Yes, look, absolutely. I'm absolutely confident in the senior leadership of the prison service to conduct a rigorous, searching and fair investigation. And I've also, as I say, got this independent investigation as well. But on these core...
you're not telling me you have confidence in the governor of Wandsworth?
Well, what I'm saying about the position of the governor of Wandsworth is that I have absolute confidence in the senior leadership to get to the bottom of who did their job. You know, we want to absolutely work out, were the protocols followed as they should be? And that should, of course, apply to everyone. And it will be searching and it will be fair. But it is something, as I say, that you need to take thoroughly and you need to take in stages. And I just also want to make the point, if I may briefly, that we are moving at great pace, and I hope to be able to announce next week the terms of reference for the independent investigation that I've referred to.
All right, you mentioned a moment ago the issue of categorisation. Now, Khalif was in what is called a Category B prison, which are training prisons and local prisons. Quite serious places. I've been in Wandsworth, but they're not high security like Belmarsh. This will be part of the review, but just, you must know the answer to this now. Do you know who would have allocated him to a Category B prison?
Well, as you say, this is part of the review, but what tends to happen is those people who are accused, of course not convicted, accused of certain offences will be considered for categorisation. But this is an important point, that although it's, of course, a very serious matter, it's not without its complexity. So, for example, it's not the case, as it were, that everybody who is to be charged with a specific offence under a specific piece of legislation would automatically go into a certain category of prison. It will depend upon the circumstances, first of all, to do with the risk that they would pose were they to be escape. Do you see the point?
I get the point, but there isn't that much room for doubt when someone is charged with a terror offence. I mean, this was a very serious offence. And now, we may find that actually it isn't as serious as it looks, but on the face of it, this is as serious as it gets.
Well, look,
why is he in a Category B prison?
And so this is absolutely what I want to get to the bottom of, and that's precisely why I set up the investigation, this searching investigation. As I say, the only point I just want to gently make is that it's not entirely without this complexity. I mean, my background is as a lawyer. One of the offences that he's charged with is Section 58A, but Section 58 of the Terrorism Act 2000. Of course, anything under the Terrorism Act is extremely serious, but it is possible for people to be charged with that offence who the police and the prosecution accept has got no terrorist ideology at all, but is in possession of material that they ought not to be in possession of. So now, let's not get into the details of this because this person will have to stand trial. But equally, all I'm saying is that there might be someone charged under, I don't know, the Criminal Damage Act, for example, and yet they are serial arsonists, allegedly, arson with intent to endanger life, and plainly there are different risk matrix. So we just have to look at the facts, and I wanted to take
I'm not going to drag you into the individual case, but let me ask you a more general question.
Sure.
Do you know how many individuals charged under Section 5 or Section 58, the terrorism offences, are in Category B prisons rather than Category A prisons?
Well, look, what I can say is in respect of Wandsworth, because I wanted to ensure out of an abundance of caution that prison, that every resource is put into that prison to get to the bottom of what happened and to ensure that security is preserved, is that out of an abundance of caution that some prisoners there, some of those on remand, have been moved. And that is, as I say, out of an abundance of caution.
Do you mean moved this week?
Yes, because I wanted to make... Yeah, so additional resources, of course, gone into Wandsworth, so there's additional governor support, a former governor with particular expertise in security, but also, as I say, out of an abundance of caution, around 40 prisoners have been moved to, just while we get to the bottom of what took place in Wandsworth. That is a sensible precautionary measure, as I say, out of an abundance of caution.
So you've moved people from Wandsworth who you think might be threats, who might not belong there. You still haven't quite answered my question. Do you know how many of these kinds of people charged with these very serious offences are in Category B prisons rather than the highest security prisons?
In your question, you mentioned two offences. You mentioned Section 5. So that's Section 5 of the Terrorism Act 2006. So that would be preparing an act of terrorism. Yeah. It is overwhelmingly likely that those who have been charged with those matters will be in Category A. Is it the case that all those charged with Section 58, being in possession of material which likely to be of assistance to a person planning an act of terrorism, that could be, as I say, somebody who has searched for something online, who everyone accepts is not in and of themselves as somebody who is motivated by terrorism? It wouldn't be the case. And incidentally, that piece of legislation has been enforced since 2000. So for the thick end of a quarter of a century, categorisation decisions have been made on a case-by-case basis. As I say, look, I just want to make the point. I have, of course, concerns about this issue, which is precisely why I've set up the investigation. I just want to make clear that there are complexities, that's all.
I understand, but, I don't want to get too fussy about language, but you've just used the phrase overwhelmingly likely. What that tells me is that nobody in your department actually knows the answer to the question I asked you, which is how many of these people who are charged with these serious offences are in Category B rather than Category A offences. And presumably, when you complete your review, that is one of the questions you're going to be asking. Is that right? And is the decision-making on this appropriate?
Right. So this is a really important matter because you have people who are on remand, but you also have serving prisoners. So although you're talking about a trainer, that tends to be a Category C trainer. Now, people work their way through sentences, and it can be the case that somebody who starts in a Category A, as they are rehabilitated, as they get ready for release, that they move through the system. So that is an important part of, yes, of course, security is the number one priority. We also want to ensure that prisoners are rehabilitated through the system. So that is precisely why I've asked for an investigation into the facts of this specific case, the Khalif case, but also an investigation into the wider system of categorisation, because these are legitimate questions which I want answers to as well.
All right, let's talk about the wider system. I mean, one thing's clear, and I think you have acknowledged this yourself, we don't have enough prison staff. You're trying to recruit more. Of the ones that we do have, a lot of them are off sick. The number of sick days claimed since 2018 annually is up 60%. And here's the most concerning thing, perhaps. Of those who are on duty, a high proportion are inexperienced. Overall, 1 in 6 are in their first year in the job. Added up, isn't this a system designed for a disaster?
Well, let me just step back for a second. The first thing to say is that the condition of our prisons is, of course, very important. This is the government that has done more to put money where its mouth is, to invest very heavily in our prisons. And here's a statistic which I think is important. The second biggest programme of government outside HS2 is in prison modernisation and expansion.
I've got that. I'm going to come to the prison estate. I'm asking you about the prison staff.
No, and of course, but having also a safe and decent environment for prison staff as well is very important. And I meet prison staff, and I do just want to make this point. They do an exceptionally important job, because people on those wings have to have the judgment to know when to hold the line and to be firm and robust so you have a safe prison, but also when to show compassion when people are going through difficulty. But this is a really important... So that's why we've accepted the response of the Prison Service Pay Review Body to provide that 7%. That's why we are recruiting, and additionally, 700 additional people into the prison service since May of last year. And here's the really important point. The so-called attrition rate, you know what that means,
yes,
effectively, is actually down.
The rate at which
you've got it.
People leave. I understand that.
Exactly. So that
but
is down.
But you're still
that is
way
down.
short of what you want.
So I am absolutely clear and candid. We want to recruit more people. That is true. But if you look at the trajectory, 4,000 more since around 2006. And as I say, that isn't historic. We are on that trajectory as well. Oh. And we have accepted these pay review because we accept they are really phenomenal people who do an extremely difficult job. We value them hugely. That's why I had hosted reception number 10 for them last week. And I really want to encourage people into the service.
All right, but let's talk about the conditions. Overcrowding in Wandsworth, we're told, is running at about 75%. It means too many prisoners are locked up too many hours a day. Men are in cells designed for one person with a cellmate, which means that, let us be frank about it, they have to defecate in front of other people. Now, you've got a building programme. It's going to add 20,000 places over the next 4 years. I want you to look at this. Let's look at what your department predicts for the growth in the prison population over that period. Right now, it's around about 85,000, and it will grow to, I think, 104,000. Now, 104,000, I know, is the top prediction, but that could be where you are. So you will add 20,000 places, and you'll add 20,000 prisoners. So they will continue to be as overcrowded and shockingly bad conditions as they are now.
So a few things to say. You talked about crowding. So if you go back 20, 25 years, the levels of so-called crowding are approximately the same in somewhere like Wandsworth. But the difference is we are the government that has been absolutely determined. And by the way, this Prime Minister, when he was Chancellor, to put very significant money into it. And in the interest of balance, I think it's important to know, if you go to some of these modern prisons, so this isn't just saying, OK, we'll spend some money and hopefully we'll get some prisons. If you go, for example...
Well, most of the estate is not modern at all.
No, but if you go, to, for example, to HMP Berwyn, if you go to HMP Five Wells or HMP Foss Way, I would love to take you there, Trevor. It is quite remarkable. So you go in, I want you to imagine, if you would, you have extraordinary workshops where people can learn, joinery. It's really a safe, decent, rehabilitative prison. And that's what modernising the estate is about.
But, Secretary, most prisons aren't like that. Actually, let me show you something else. I don't want to do too much of a slideshow, but let me show you something else, written by a leading Conservative figure in 2017. And he said, in a decent society, prisons must be places of safety, they must be humane. Today, our prisons are far too violent and far too crowded. Society should not have a bleeding heart about its prisoners, but it shouldn't have blood on its hands either. That is very strong language.
Yeah. And look, but I agree with every syllable of that. I absolutely agree. We should be robust, the safety of the public, but we want to have a humane...
That's not where we are, is it?
But it's precisely why we're investing so heavily. So, as I say, this £4 billion is important. But also, if I could just add one other thing, because you talked about prison officers... Very quick. No, but just very... because it matters. That's why we've invested £100 million for prisoner security. So that means that all the officers have body-worn videos, because that's how you dial down the temperature in prison.
But, by the way, do you know who this is?
Well, it could be... Frankly, it could be any number of my excellent colleagues. Is it me?
Actually, it's you.
Well, there you go.
From your own constituency website. And
I agree with it.
I hear that your point about your ambitions, but we are now 6 years on from the time you made that statement.
Yes,
and you would acknowledge we are
Trevor,
nowhere near that humane system.
But
you would acknowledge that we are not in the humane situation.
Shall I tell you where we are? We've got 2 brand new prisons that are set up, plus Millsike is being constructed.
You would acknowledge that your ambitions have not been met.
We've got further to do, but what I would also acknowledge is that there are 4,000 more officers since that time, that we've opened Foss Way, that we've opened Five Wells, that Millsike is being built, that we've got refurbishments taking place in house blocks in Liverpool, in Stockton, in Rye Hill, in Birmingham, that there's a huge amount of effort that is going, and resource that is going into this.
OK, you can go through all the prisons. Let me just ask you one other thing. There's so many other things I could talk to you about prisons. Sure. Including, by the way, that there have been 7 prison ministers in the last 4 years, which is another thing.
I was one of them.
I know you were. Yeah. But I think that might be part of the explanation for where we are. But I want to ask you about something that's come up today. The Prime Minister said in Delhi yesterday that he wouldn't rule out squeezing welfare benefits in order to provide room for tax cuts. Now, some of your backbench colleagues think that's a good thing. They think tax cuts are vital to boost the economy pre-election. Is this a live cabinet discussion?
Well, look, that's a matter for the autumn state. It's a matter for the Chancellor. I do just want to...
No, I'm just asking if you guys in the cabinet talk about it.
As you know, I can't talk about what happens in the cabinet. It's the whole purpose of the cabinet.
You can tell me what the agenda is.
As you know, I can't talk about it. But I think the really important thing to note is that, and it's relevant to prisons, so this government put in £94 billion to support people when the cost of living, particularly in respect of gas and electricity. To put that £94 billion in context, the total prisons budget is around about £5 billion. So very, very significant sums going in, and that's before you consider freezing fuel duty and so on.
But you're a big cheese now in the cabinet. If the Chancellor came forward this suggestion, would you be personally comfortable with the idea of squeezing benefit to provide tax cuts?
We must do everything we can for the most disadvantaged in society. But it's important because that's why we put up benefits by 10%, 10.1%, and also universal credit, but also the pension as well. So we want to ensure, I will want to ensure, my colleagues will want to ensure that we are decent, humane, and that we support people.
I'm taking that as a no.
You can take it as you like.
Justice Secretary, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Trevor.
Well, that was the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk. Let's get some reaction from our panel now. Each week we'll be joined by 3 independent-minded people from the world of politics, journalism or further afield. And this week we have another stellar lineup. Firstly, a man who needs no introduction to a Sunday morning political interviews programme, broadcaster Andrew Marr. And with him, the journalist and Times columnist Melanie Phillips and the editor of The Spectator, Fraser Nelson. Andrew, if you can resist the temptation to mark my homework, let's just start with this issue of... Because I'm intimidated by you, obviously.
Yeah.
But this allocation issue. There's a problem here. He didn't really deal with it.
This is the Category A, Category B question. Well, I interviewed Neil Basu this week for LBC, who was for a very long time in charge of the counter-terrorism police, the specialist police and the Met and so on. He knows what he's talking about. And he told me that anyone charged with a terror offence ought to be in a Category A prison. And either he was not there because there was something very odd about the way he'd been charged and there was something specific to his case, given that he was actually boasting in prison, according to the Sunday Mirror today, that he was going to get out. Just watch me, he kept saying. Of course, nobody did watch him. Then he should clearly have been in the Category A. And Neil Basu suggested that is because they do not have enough Category A places.
Oh, really? So you think that they basically just parked him there because
they didn't have enough places in a nick where he could be safely kept from escaping.
Yeah, what would say? I was more worried. I was equally worried, Melanie, by the fact that the Secretary of State didn't really seem to know what the numbers on this were. You'd think that you would know where all the suspected terrorists are, wouldn't you?
Well, it's possible that, far be it for me to suggest that he was being disingenuous, but it's possible that he wasn't telling you the entire truth that as he knew it. It's also possible that, as you were implying, no one in his department knows, because it seems to me that, across a wide spectrum of government, no one knows very much about anything, because, record keeping has sort of gone down the pan along with other things too. I mean, the question about this escaped fugitive, as he was, is not just the category of prison he was put into, whether that was right or wrong, but having been put into it, he was apparently given the plum posting of work in the kitchen. It's as far as I can read, as far as I can see, it's an elementary measure of prison security that you only put people in the kitchen who are entirely safe, and you vet them very, very thoroughly. And so the question to me, from what Alex Chalk was saying, and again, he didn't really grapple with this, it's not simply a question of numbers, and you put it to him that they were inexperienced, that prison officers were inexperienced. From what I'm reading, a number of prison officers who were very experienced were cleared out for reasons to do with economy, cutting, and possibly incompetent management, and replaced by young officers who really have no experience and are in a state of terror about managing a prison which they can't deal with.
Fraser, going to the politics of this, the government can't get a break, can it? I mean, every prison break, every day or two, there is something new that just whacks them.
Yes, and when you're on the skids, you tend to keep skidding. Now, the problem for the government is that these prison breaks are not unheard of. By and large, every year, something like 12 people escape from prison. Now, if there's a theme of government incompetence here, if the next person who breaks out is way more likely to become a national story, there's going to be more interviews like that. But that's not the worst of it. Even though there was like 12 prison breaks, there's something like 40 or 50 prisoners every year who are released by accident, by bureaucratic incompetence. Now, this is something which, unfortunately, is simply standard. It doesn't make the headlines because people have got used to it. But all of a sudden, this will be seen...
What sort of accident is that?
Well, you can get the paperwork mixed up. They can get the sentencing. You can get some people in remand awaiting trial. There is some confused message comes through. There's figures for it on the Department of... They count it. They're very good at counting the number of people they release by accident, but they're not very good at making sure the accidents don't happen. Now, this sort of thing is going to be cast in a new light now. And from now until election time, I think, the Conservatives are going to be caught. And questions are going to be asked because the prisons have been a soft target for the spending cuts. The NHS is a very hard target, very difficult to take money from there. Far easier to take money from defence, from infrastructure projects, and from the day-to-day management of prisons. We had a former inmate at Wandsworth writing for The Spectator recently, saying he was amazed this thing didn't happen more often, given the bedlam and the confusion. The guards struggle to count the prisoners. They all think somebody's escaped when they haven't, simply because they haven't been able to do the sums. So this, unfortunately, is a standard occurrence now coming into focus. And that's why, as you say, it could get worse.
Melanie, this is all part of a larger narrative. You've been writing about this, and you quoted a poll by Lord Ashcroft, the former deputy chair of the Conservative Party, that found that 72% of his sample, which including more than half of 2019 Conservative voters, agreed that nothing seems to work properly any longer.
Well, we do seem to be living through, every day brings another self-inflicted catastrophe, which is almost comical, were it not so tragic. While it's also true that, what's not reported is stuff that works. We all know that. But nevertheless, I think that there is an accelerating amount of stuff that is fairly basic, that doesn't work at a fairly basic level. And the question is, it's being said as a sort of headline thing, is Britain bust? Is Britain broken? And a lot of people think Britain is broken. And it's very damaging to this government in particular, because the Conservatives, main claim to fame is, we are the party of competence. And unfortunately, Rishi Sunak is like, the child in the party game who's left holding the parcel, because this is the result of years and years of mounting incompetence as cans are kicked down the road. Difficult decisions are put off. Money is cut, and it's put forward as if it's progress. Peter is robbed to pay Paul, and all the rest of it.
Absolutely. I mean, there is a danger in all of this of falling into the easy narrative. It's a bit like RAC, it's a bit like the schools, etc. In fact, Alex Chalk's right. It has been the biggest building programme since Victorian times that they've now embarked upon. But as you pointed out, the number of prisoners keeps going up, and the government always wants to imprison more people.
Yeah, we can see the graph of that again.
Now kids using laughing gas is the latest target, and so on. So they have got a big problem. When it comes to the prisons like Wandsworth, they are very old. They are literally crumbling. And the big failure of investment hasn't been the actual structure and the programmes, the new prisons. They're doing quite well on that, actually. It has been the prison officers. They haven't had enough senior officers and all the rest. So that is the crucial thing. But I also think, Alex Chalk there started his career, I think, as a political advisor to George Osborne. And I think if the Conservatives are in trouble at the moment, it is because of the Osborne-Cameron austerity years. And, you can have competence or lack of competence in government, but if you're not spending the money over time to ensure that the prison estate, to ensure the schools, the courts, the rivers and so forth are properly invested in, then you're going to get this. So it is the consequence of 14 years. I
don't want to go back over the issue of austerity, but Fraser, your magazine has... in fact, you ran Broken Britain as a front cover. Front cover this week. And the burden of your economics editor's big piece on this is that, in a sense, a phrase that Melody's issues, that we are a sticking plaster country where for the last 10, 20 years, the choice has always been to sort of fix something now rather than deal with the underlying problem. And the chickens are coming home to roost.
Well, in the cover piece, what Kate Andrews argued was that the government is actually spending way more than the Blair era, something like 50% more public spending. So it's not as if it's been austere, but there's been a big difference. On some levels, you've absolutely splurged on benefits for pensioners. We've now got something like 5.3 million people on out-of-work benefits. The bill for that racks up. You've got debt interest as well. And so in some areas, there's lots of spending, but in other areas, the investment has been cut right back. And that's an infrastructure or things that might you get the return from in 5 or 8 years. Because politics has been caught in a short-term trap. The number of elections, the sheer turnover of prime ministers, the number of ministers, as you were saying there. So when that happens, nobody's really thinking of 4 years' time because they're not going to be there.
The turnover of ministers is really
actually,
serious.
we can just have a... This is one of my favourite slides of the year.
It is astonishing, but can I just point out why...
7 prison ministers.
Why that matters, because Alex Chalk there was very fluent with the numbers. He'd memorised an awful lot of numbers before he talked to you, Trevor. But in the end, you need ministers who actually know what's going on. Can I return us to 1966 and the Wilson government, when the young prisons minister, Shirley Williams, was rather concerned about the treatment of women in prison. So she decided she was going to go herself and get herself locked up, banged up in Holloway, which she did, and she said, so what is the normal offence for women in Holloway? And they said, well, I'm afraid, Minister, prostitution is the main offence. She said, OK, I'll go in as a prostitute. And she spent 2 weeks inside the prison. Nobody knew who she was, just looking at the conditions. That's the kind of prison minister who changes conditions.
Last week, Rachel Johnson said on this programme that MPs would benefit from a turn in prison. I think what she meant was this kind of knowledge. But are politics in a situation where actually, we're coming up again, as I think Fraser's magazine's been arguing, we're coming up with solutions in government to the wrong problems and kicking, as you said, kicking a can down the road all the time.
Yes, well, I mean, I think there's a number of elements to this. I think that politics is in a very difficult position at the moment across the West, because I think the West is facing a number of very fundamental issues, which are to do with the level at which, among other things, the level at which, in a democracy, democratically elected politicians feel the need to promise stuff to their electors to get elected, which they cannot possibly deliver.
In fact, in your piece, you talked about the public's moral disgust at that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
I thought that was a strong phrase, even for Melanie Phillips.
I think it was quite mild by my standards, actually. But anyway, but I mean, the public are being taken for suckers across the West. They are not being treated ever as grown-ups. They are being infantilised. It's being assumed that they want a load of stuff and we have to promise to give it to them, even though we're not giving it to them. What they actually want, a lot of it, we, the ruling elite, deem to be so awful, we are never going to give it to them, but we're going to kind of pretend that we are doing other stuff. And so people are taken for suckers. People have withdrawn trust and faith in the democratic process. It's fantastically dangerous. And now we have this level of sustained incompetence, which has grown up from one of the legacies of all of this, which is making it even more dangerous.
So, Andrew Marr, representative of the left-wing liberal elite.
Left-wing liberal elite. Well, may I mention the New Statesman, since we've been talking about Spectator, very fine magazines both, where we've been doing very similar analysis, actually. And the way we see it is that the trouble is that the British economy is simply too small to give the British public the kind of public services and living that they have come to think they expect and deserve. And the problem is going to be growth. To that extent, Liz Truss was right all along. Growth is she came up with the wrong answer to it, clearly, but growth is going to be the big problem going ahead.
I'm sticking with political editor of the New Statesman says Liz Truss was right. We will return to this in a moment. We'll be getting our panel's take again throughout the show. Do stay with us for that. It's a little after 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. In the last hour, the Justice Secretary has told me that protocols were in place, but he doesn't know if they were followed at Wandsworth Prison, from where terrorist suspect Daniel Khalif escaped. He says 40 prisoners have been moved out of the jail, but he couldn't tell me how many terror suspects are in Category B prisons. In just a moment, we'll hear from Labour's Shadow Business and Trade Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds. Amid questions about the dire straits of the prison estate, we'll speak to the man who pledged to quit unless things improved, former Prisons Minister Rory Stewart. And with a new COVID variant on the rise ahead of the big return to university, we'll hear from a face of the pandemic, Public Health Professor at the University of Edinburgh, Devi Sridhar. Well, we spent plenty of the morning discussing the problems facing Britain. Labour wants to be the alternative government in waiting, so now to a theme I'm sure we'll return to again and again in the coming months. What would Labour do differently? After keeping his job in this week's Shadow Cabinet reshuffle, I can now speak to the Shadow Business and Trade Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds. Good morning, Mr. Reynolds.
Good morning, Trevor.
Congratulations on keeping your job. This morning, Sharon Graham, who is the head of the largest trade union, Unite, and the union to which you belong, by the way, says, and I'm quoting here, a policy mix found down the back of a 1990s sofa will fail. She calls your leadership a 1990s, by which she means Blairite, I think, tribute band. Is that fair?
No, unsurprisingly, I reject that quite comprehensively. Now, let me say at the beginning, I am very proud of the achievements of the last Labour government. I think if you compare that government to what we've had since 2010, that's a government of real achievements, real substance. That compares very favourably to what we've seen. But look, as a Labour Party, we look to the future, not the past. And if you look at, for instance, whether it's the growth of the gig economy, and we have a package of new employment rights to make sure people have got the security they need in the workplace. If you look at the challenge of climate change, net zero, but making sure we get the maximum economic benefits of that. We've got policies that I'm in charge of around our industrial policy, our green prosperity plan, making sure industries, which are often full, by the way, of Unite members, like aerospace and steel, can make the transition by working with government in partnership with the private sector, to deliver on what is required. And there are different policies we're putting forward now that would be different to the past. So I reject that entirely and say, look, we will be a government, if we get the chance to be that government, focused on long-term solutions that are right for the here and now, which deliver for every part of this country.
So when you were at the Trade Union Congress this week, you'll be talking to Sharon Graham and explaining to her that her calls for taking utilities into public ownership and so on really aren't what I nearly said New Labour, but Starmer Labour is about.
Well, look, I would simply say a lot of the discussion that is made in relation to this seems to say there's some sort of false choice on offer between reassuring people and offering them hope. And I think we are offering people hope. I think our agenda is comprehensive. But you don't do that unless you've got sound foundations in place. And they are, for instance, being trusted on the public finances, having a sustainable bond market so you can finance the very large and significant debt this country has, having a stable currency, having a belief in the basic competence of this government. I mean, if you don't have that, let's be clear, Liz Truss a year ago thought she was being radical. She may have been radical, but she was radically bad because she didn't understand those sound foundations have to be in place. So I just reject, Trevor, entirely the idea you choose between reassuring people and offering people hope. I think the two things go hand in hand, and that is why I think we're in a position where more and more people, whatever they think of this government, are willing to trust Labour with their vote next time round.
I'll just give this one more go. She basically says it's sort of better to have Labour than the Tories, but the Labour Party, as led by Keir Starmer, really isn't doing much that's different. What can you say to her that will persuade her that you aren't just a bunch of retreads, warmed over Blairism, I think is the expression that was used?
I would say, again, look at the policy platform we have out there. Look at our plans for industrial strategy. Look at our plans for the green prosperity plan. Look at our changes to the apprenticeship levy to make sure the skills system will work well. Look at our changes to planning or making Brexit work, or our future relationship with other countries in terms of trade deals, or even, indeed, the devolution plans we've got around things like the skills budgets for big cities. These are things that make a difference, but the only way you'll get a chance to do those things if you can make sure people trust you, believe you're taking these challenges seriously. And of course, that the climate today is very different to how it was in the late 1990s. Our policy platform reflects that. But by the way, we've got to respond to what we would inherit if we get the chance to do that. And clearly, on some questions, the national finances are in a challenging position, as are public services.
All right. Well, let's take something concrete, and literally concrete. Your colleagues were saying all of last week that the coalition government was wrong to have dropped Labour's Building for the Future programme, the building programme for schools, at £55 billion. That was the price attached to that programme. Would Labour, if it came into power next year, reintroduce that programme with the £55 billion ticket?
Well, Trevor, look, schools are just the latest thing to crumble in Tory Britain. And of course, Labour governments build schools. I want to see that happen. You will understand I'm not going to give you specific capital allocation programmes before I know the baseline that any government would inherit. And of course, we've got a number of fiscal events that we will have before we get to a likely
Can I just ask you to hang on for a second? You know enough, and you've decided enough to tell us that the Tories were wrong to drop it, but you don't know enough, and you're not certain enough to know that you wouldn't reintroduce it. I mean, either they were wrong and you would do the right thing, or they weren't wrong. Which is it?
No, Trevor, the fact is that was a programme that would have rebuilt every secondary school in this country by 2020. So when you have schools falling down, it's reasonable to point out the government have some responsibility there. What you can do in terms of funding that in future depends on your economic position. This economy we've had for 13 years has fared far worse than it did under the last Labour government. Under that government, growth was stronger. There was more money, therefore, to spend on the public services, so you could make a very clear pledge like that. Getting back to that is what we want to return to. We do have specific plans where we say we'll do things differently. I mean, for instance, taxing private education in a different way, or scrapping the allowances that currently exist for people who earn money from private equity, or scrapping the non-DOMS regime, the super tax regime, and we make clear where we'd spend that money. But the big picture, whether it is schools, the NHS, the prison system, the criminal justice system, the economy's got to work better to make those pledges. Hence our industrial strategy and our plans
those
in my
extra
area.
those extra tax promises, you're talking hundreds of millions rather than the billions. OK, let me ask you a pretty straightforward one. Would you commit to building more new schools and repairing more schools than the current government has committed?
Trevor, I'll have to give you the same answer. Of course, I want to be able to do that. Of course, I look to previous Labour governments that have been able to do things like that. But if we have an economy, whatever the recent revisions from the ONS about our performance since the pandemic, the fact is this has been 13 years of poor economic performance, and that limits the kind of policies and aspirations you've got. Until you're fixing the economy, it will be more difficult. So,
But you see what the problem is here, Mr. Reynolds. You see what the problem is, Mr. Reynolds? You're spending a lot of time telling us that the government's wrong, but you can't ever say you would do something different. And it's hard then to argue with Sharon Graham that, as she implies, there's not much between you and the Tories.
No, I disagree entirely with two important points on that. First of all, we've got very specific plans where we would do things differently, whether that is the funding that would come to breakfast clubs for every child in the country because of the changes to how we would treat the allowances for private schools in the tax system, whether it is spending the money from scrapping the non-DOMS tax regime and putting more money into the NHS. So we've got very different plans, but I will make no apologies for coming back to the basic fact that unless the economy grows more strongly, there will be harder challenges. And actually, you do not give people hope by ignoring those challenges. I am very confident we can raise business investment, get good jobs in all parts of the country, and that will give us the revenue to invest in the way previous Labour governments have been able to do in the public realm.
OK, let me try and see if I can find another point of difference, if I can put it that way. The government, Mr. Sunak is in India talking about new trade agreements. How would a trade agreement with India, negotiated by Starmer and Reynolds, differ from one negotiated by Sunak and Badenoch? And in particular, would you offer the Indians the concessions they want on immigration to make it easier for business people and students from India to come here and stay here?
Well, first of all, Trevor, there isn't, as it stands, an agreement we can look at to tell you what I can do differently about that. I would say that we would like to see that trade deal with India. It is a huge potential opportunity. It's one of the obvious opportunities we've got. Now we're doing trade policy in a different way following Brexit. So I think there are huge opportunities there. Look, the proportionality of the market access that we would get relative to concessions in any other area, that is essentially what this deal hinges on. But if we got that right, it would be very positive for the economy, so we'd be certainly very optimistic and receptive to that case. But ultimately, we've got to make sure we're getting what we need, because to be honest, to date, the trade deals the government has achieved have either been, they haven't been delivered, they've been no deals, or they've been bad deals, and that isn't good enough. It can't be about the quantity of trade deals, it's got to be about the quality of them.
Last point. We read this morning that your leader is going to be talking about immigration at the end of this week, and that Labour is going to go tough. Is this Labour converging with the Conservatives in a sense from the other side, that you want to convince voters that you will? I think the phrase that's been briefed is bring order to the borders. Is this going to be a new Labour position?
It's not about classifying this in any kind of political label at all. This is about us being clear. There are no-go areas for us, that we will tackle the real problems, that our agenda has something to offer for everyone, no matter how they look at the potential problems of this country and what they want a potential government to be able to deliver. Fundamentally, this is a problem where what you've seen from the Conservative Party is a series of gimmicks, things like the Rwanda scheme or the photo ops, and we don't feel the government are really serious about tackling this. We think they want the issue to continue. They want somehow to get credit for talking about it, even though they never fix it. And Keir Starmer is about serious, long-term, serious answers, not sticking plasters to the country's problems. So he's going to say, rather than waste that money on the Rwanda scheme that won't work, spend that money on the National Crime Agency with a proper unit to smash the criminal gangs that are part of this. Take the money that that we're currently spending on hotel costs, accommodation costs, invest that to make sure we're getting back just to processing the number of claims we were a few years ago. I mean, there are nearly 9,000 or 10,000 fewer claims being done on these things than 2015. This is at the heart of the problem. So Keir is about serious, long-term answers to that, and we'll talk about anything. There's nothing we're not willing to consider in terms of getting that agenda right.
Mr. Reynolds, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
That was the Shadow Business and Trade Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds. Let's go back to our panel. Andrew Marr, Melanie Phillips and Fraser Nelson. Fraser, that was interesting. Did you detect anything that you would say to a voter that will explain what Labour would do differently to the Tories?
Well, verbally, they would do pretty much everything differently, they tell us. But as soon as you ask how this would be achieved, that's when it dries up. So, for example, he was saying, well, growth has been dreadful over the last 13 years. I mean, actually, over 13 years, it's been one of the best of any major European countries. But the tax was lower under the Labour years. No wonder growth was higher. Are they going to lower tax? I'm not quite sure. So right now, we're at the stage now where they are being seen as a government in waiting. Quite right, too. The polls suggest there's the bookmakers say there's a 90% chance Keir Starmer is going to be the next Prime Minister, in which case people are entitled to ask, well, how would you achieve all of these things?
Andrew, it may be tactically a good bet to wait for the Conservatives to lose rather than...
It probably is.
Put up something for Labour to win, as it were.
It probably is, but we're living in this kind of weird, phony war at the moment where Starmer and Rachel Reeves are absolutely crystal clear they are not going to raise any tax rates across the board because they know the minute they start to indicate, then the Conservatives completely go for them. So you ask them, basically you were saying to him, are you going to raise taxes? He has to say no. I'd say a couple of things about this.
Very quickly.
A couple of things about this. First of all, Labour are relying on growth because they're going to have an activist government with a plan. I think that's highly optimistic. Second, I think in due course, when they're in power, they are going to have to raise some money, and they are going to do it, but they're not going to tell you about it now.
Melanie?
I think this interview precisely demonstrates why the Labour vote is so soft, why people don't like the Conservative government, but they don't trust the Labour Party to deliver anything because they don't even know what they're going to deliver. Everything seems to change the whole time. Keir Starmer changes his position and so on. But I mean, I think, what Sharon Graham said, I mean, much of it was, we want to go back to old Labour, we want trade union power and so on. But her fundamental diagnosis is correct. When you look at Starmer's Labour and the Conservative Party, what's to choose between them?
Wow, we're getting it all this morning. Melanie Phillips says Sharon Graham is right. Right, we are going to be joined by someone who thought British jails were so full of violence and drugs, he'd resign if he couldn't fix the problems. That's this man who's just joined us, the former Cabinet Minister, Rory Stewart.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. Greg Milam, Sky News, Manchester.
Welcome back. This is Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. The Justice Secretary told me a little earlier that 40 prisoners have been moved out of Wandsworth Prison. But just how bad is the British prison system? Back when he was Prisons Minister, Rory Stewart said he'd resign if he hadn't turned around jails within a year. Well, more than 5 years later, there's still a staffing crisis, outdated buildings with drug use and violence widespread. Rory Stewart's written a new book about his time in politics, and he is with me now. Good morning.
Good morning.
Before we get into prisoners, can I just ask you about the awful news from North Africa, with which you're very familiar? What should we be doing to help Morocco?
Well, the first thing is very urgent cash assistance, because in these emergency situations, people's lives have been devastated in a matter of minutes. I was in the Turkey earthquake, and in fact I was in Morocco very recently. What you find is a sense of complete devastation and terror because of the aftershocks. The most useful thing you can do is to get cash to people. It's often very tempting to send food or clothes, but the markets are working in Morocco. If you give people cash, they can address their own individual family needs. Often if you're sending clothes or food, you're sending an inappropriate thing to people. So there are many organizations. I work with one called Give Directly that's now providing cash support in Morocco. But you'll see UN agencies and others going in. And I think getting the support in quickly is vital in those first 3-4 days.
OK. Another story that's come up this morning is the report that Parliament has been infiltrated by someone spying for China who has a parliamentary pass. Now, you were in Parliament for 11 years, as you explain in your book. Should we be reviewing the allocation of these passes?
We should be reviewing two things. Yes, absolutely, the passes, and secondly, the funding, because one of the other things that's come out with China is not just that there's a researcher in there, but that people with strong links to the Chinese Communist Party have been giving money to Labour MPs and employing former Conservative MPs. So I'm very worried about the parliamentary passes, and you'll remember that there was also a case of somebody with apparent associations with Russia, who was a parliamentary researcher for an MP, getting access to the Defence Committee. We have to be much, much more serious. Russia and China have aggressive espionage agencies. The Chinese intelligence agency, one of the largest in the world. They're desperate to suborn countries across the world, and Britain is not being serious enough.
I won't ask you how you know what you do about spying, but how seriously do you take the threat to our democracy from that kind of activity?
Very seriously. Remember, this is not the 1990s where the number of democracies in the world was doubling. We're now in a world where we've just had coups right across Africa, right the way across Sahel, now going down into Gabon, 7 countries. Democracy's been taken over by a military coup. And again, many of those countries waving Russian flags, receiving support from China. And it's in the interests of authoritarian states to weaken countries like the United Kingdom. So we should be very, very cautious.
Your former colleague in the House of Commons, Ian Duncan-Smith, Conservative MP, says that we've been deeply infiltrated by China. Penetrated, I think, is the word he used.
I'm always very reluctant to agree with Ian Duncan-Smith. He and I have huge standoffs. But I think I'd prefer to quote Lord Evans, the former head of MI5, who's been very clear about the fact, both in a House of Lords report, but also when he was the head of MI5, that Britain is not being serious enough in dealing with the Chinese espionage threat.
Let's talk about prisons. You were the prisons minister who famously said that if you couldn't make things better in a year, you'd resign. They promoted you, so you didn't actually have to do that.
Well, I did actually do it. I mean, we got violence down, but you're quite right. We didn't address the underlying problems. Yeah.
What, can I just ask you, if the escape of Daniel Khalif had happened on your watch, would you have resigned?
Difficult question. I definitely think that it's important for ministers to take full responsibility. I think the problem, I mean, you've just been interviewing Alex Chalk. There are 120 prisons in England and Wales. There were escapes on my watch. And his experience, I guess, will have been like mine. You wake up, you get an immediate call saying someone's escaped, and for the first few days, you're just trying to work out what on earth happened. You know, how did this happen? And the story changes, as you can imagine, minute by minute. You have to get on the ground in Wandsworth, try to talk to the governor. In this particular case, it seems clear, if he had strapping underneath this vehicle, that there was some kind of collusion and support. But it's also clear that they seemed to spend, I don't know, half an hour, 45 minutes before they even noticed he was gone from the kitchen. And he shouldn't have been in the kitchen in the first place.
So you think possible collusion? You think that the allocation of to the kitchen, which is a vulnerable area, was wrong, and that somebody must have fallen down on the job? That if you were prisons minister, that would be where you'd be landing this morning.
100%. And the bigger issue, which you've put up earlier in the show, is the prison population. These prisons
we can show that again.
Totally unmanageable. And the main thing that I was trying to do with David Gauke when I was in government is reduce the prison population. David Gauke was the Secretary of State for Justice at the time. Is reduce the prison population.
Now, one of the things that I think I just wanted to put to you, because you've had the actual experience, seems to be that we don't quite know what the prisons minister would do, not least because prisons ministers come and go very quickly. We've had 7 since 2019. And you've said in your book, here they are, 7 of them. In fact, one of them's been in the job twice, Lucy Fraser. You said in your book, when you were appointed prisons minister, I hadn't spoken to a prisoner or a prison officer in 20 years. I'd never met someone who worked in probation. But thanks to the genius of the British ministerial system, I was now responsible for all the prisons, prisoners, ex-offenders, prison officers, probation officers, and sentencing policy in England and Wales. It does make it sound a bit mad.
It's completely mad. And that's what this book, Politics on the Edge, is trying to do. I'm trying to be honest about how bad it is. As a minister, you're trying to put a brave face on things. You're trying to come on programmes like this and defend yourself. The truth is, you could not run a fish and chip shop in the way in which the British government is run. It's insane. And I try to do a good job. I'm sure Alex Chalk is working very, very hard. It's not that politicians are necessarily incompetent or daft. It's that these jobs are mad. It cannot make sense to put somebody into a job as important as that for just a few months. Look at the number of defence secretaries we've had. Look at the fact that Grant Shapps has been through something like 5 jobs in the cabinet in just over a year. So
Nadine Zahawi holds the record, 9.
So we need governments that say you must remain in for a minimum of 2 years in these jobs unless you actually have a horrible scandal. And we need to look to the American system, where we have genuine professionals as cabinet ministers, a very limited gene pool MPs. You're taking out of about 300 MPs, putting them into these positions. And look, I'm obviously attacking myself in Politics on the Edge, because I'm trying to show how ignorant I was and what a disgrace it is that someone like me gets these jobs.
I was very struck that you use the word shame or shameful many times in the book. You talk about our politics as shameful. It's a very strong word.
I did feel that. So I went in, as I imagine you would or anyone would, quite idealistic, very, very proud to be in Parliament, thinking I'm going to make a real difference, I'm going to change the world. And I found that the system and structure just did not work. That the whips, the party system, these ministerial promotions, the culture of the place was fundamentally not serious. It's a miracle that Britain manages to actually keep going at all, the way that we run our politics.
Well, one of the reviewers of your book, Dominic Lawson, says you're a fish out of water. You seem baffled by the behaviour of your colleagues. Is the problem here the system, or is it that somebody like Rory Stewart, widely admired but regarded as a very unique character with a very unique background, just isn't fitted for politics in any form?
Well, I'm sure you're right. There's a bit of both. There's me and the system. But the reason I've written the book is partly to be humorous and frank about how horrible it is, but also to provoke change, because we need to change and improve.
OK. Rory Stewart, thank you very much indeed. Your book, Politics on the Edge, is out now.
Thank you very much.
Coming up after the break, a word we'd all hoped we'd started to put behind us: COVID. There's a new variant and a surge in cases. We'll try to find out what's going on.
5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Welcome back. This is Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Now, the end of January 2020 seems a long time ago. That's when the first cases of COVID were identified in the UK. We all know what followed. One of the most worrying phrases we got used to was new variant. Well, there's another one now. It has a high number of mutations and comes as COVID infections are surging. At the height of the pandemic, we'd often see my next guest on our screens. Professor Devi is the Chair of Global Public Health, Edinburgh University. And it's a time when students will be returning to universities in their tens of thousands. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
This new COVID variant, we're told it has a high number of mutations. What's special about BA286?
Well, I think it's this number of mutations. It's still a sublineage of Omicron. And so in that sense, we're still in the Omicron age. But I think here what you're seeing is its ability to reinfect those who have already had a previous version of Omicron, as well as how transmissible it is. And so those are the concerns. But I would say that, early studies are showing that it is not more severe in terms of its health impact, and also that it's not having a higher hospitalization rate. And those are the two things that we're watching carefully in terms of future variants.
The UK Health Security Agency says that 28 cases of the new variant were from a single outbreak in a care home. Does that tell us anything particular about it and give us any indication of what we should be doing when we're rolling out vaccinations this year?
Well, I think what we know is it's highly infectious. And so we are seeing this spread rapidly in those kind of environments where you have many people in in an environment where they can infect each other. I think it comes back to the booster question of who should actually be getting a booster this autumn as we head into winter, given that we know protection wanes from a vaccine over time. And there is a real case to be made for widening the criteria for who gets a booster. And as we already know, moving it sooner so that people have that protection if they are exposed to a new kind of sublineage of Omicron.
Well, in fact, the vaccination programme begins again tomorrow, and old folks like me apparently are entitled to it from day one. Is it in your mind that we should expand that from the over 65s to, for example, include people who are over 50?
Yes, definitely. And actually even pushing farther to making it accessible to those who want to have it. If we are moving towards a yearly program similar to seasonal flu, we do allow younger people, those who are living with those who are vulnerable, to go out and actually get vaccinated against flu. You can go to a pharmacy and have it done. And so I hope we are moving to a similar model, which is that if you do feel that you are vulnerable, even if you're not in one of those official categories, if you're living with someone vulnerable, if you just don't want to feel rubbish from COVID and want that extra boost for your immunity, that you could go out and get the vaccine. And so I think there is talk about this happening in future years, but given what we're seeing, COVID's still around, there's still a lot of it, there's still people ill with it. We should be thinking, how do we actually get it out now, quicker, faster, into pharmacies across the country?
So take it seriously, but there's nothing in your mind that says that we need to worry about return to lockdown?
Oh, not at all. I think people have associated public health with lockdown, but this was an incredibly extreme response that was happening in 2020 because it was a deadly disease, including for young people. And hospital systems, whether it was in Italy or here or India or anywhere in the world, were becoming overwhelmed with patients. And so I think we have to change our mind in terms of 2020. What was happening before we had a vaccine, before we had widespread immunity, the clinicians knew how to treat this, to where we are today, where it has layered on top of the infectious diseases that do make us sick and unfortunately, put people into hospital. So we're still trying to manage it, but proportionality is the key here, that actually we're trying to say, how do we maintain all the things that make our society great in terms of, people being able to live their life how they want to, but in a way that limits the damage in terms of the health, the negative impacts COVID has.
Forgive me for doing this, but as we have you on you're an important leading member of the Indian heritage diaspora in the UK, and your background is in the United States, where there is an equally important Indian diaspora. Got a Prime Minister Indian heritage in India today, who's referred to himself as India's son-in-law. What did you think he meant by that?
Well, I think, he wants right now to strike a trade deal with India, and there is a real need for us to be integrated across the world, especially given that we're no longer as integrated with Europe. And so I think it's trying to have closer relations. But I think the larger point, as someone who has an American accent, who's a British citizen, who has Indian heritage, is that actually you have more and more global citizens, and we can't be put in one box of what are you? We are a part of everywhere in the world. And I guess the other thing, which I think is promising to see across the world, especially in Britain and the States, is that skin color is no longer hopefully the defining thing people see. That actually, in the end, our skin color is different because, thousands of years ago when we migrated out of Africa, we ended up at different, parts away from the equator. And the higher away that we were in the north, in Scotland, you needed to have lighter skin to absorb vitamin D. Where if you were closer to the equator, you had darker skin. You can map skin color to actually UV light. And so I think kind of reinforcing to people that we should be judging politicians or whoever else is out there on their policies, on their merit, on terms of, who they are as people, what they are contributing, and not based on the most superficial thing about someone, which is what color they were born with because of where their ancestors ended up with, many hundreds, thousands of years ago. So that's, I think, the promising thing right now.
I understand the point, essentially, about discrimination, but there is an interesting and curious thing. Several of the world's top global companies, Microsoft and so on, are now led by Indians. And where you are, in Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, the contenders to lead Holyrood are both Scots of Indian heritage. That feels like more than an accident. It feels like it's telling us something interesting, though I have to confess I'm not sure what that thing is. What do you make of it?
Well, I think if you look at global population stats, people from South Asia probably make up 1 in 8 people on the globe. So it's not surprising to see that actually they're represented across the globe in those kind of roles. I think there's also probably a mindset among immigrants. If you come to a country or your parents have come to a country that you want to contribute, you want to show that you're useful to society, that you want to work hard, that you want to actually, show that actually that it was the right decision to have open migration and to allow people from all over to live in a certain place. So I think probably that's why you're seeing, at least in the United States, growing up, this ethic of kind of work hard, contribute to society, try to make wherever you're living better, and why you're seeing that those kind of public roles, or even in the US, I guess a lot of private CEOs are increasingly of South Asian heritage coming and becoming more prominent.
Devi, Sridhar, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you.
Still to come, I'll be joined again by our stellar panel, Andrew Marr, Melanie Phillips and Fraser Nelson.
This is, of course, wonderful news for the orangutan conservation. Bornean orangutans declined by nearly 90% since the mid-70s. That's over the last 50 years. It's quite astonishing to estimate that more than 2,000 are being hunted a single year. So it's wonderful news for the Bornean orangutans, but of course, fantastic news for all of us here, the staff, and for our visitors and supporters who can come into the zoo here in Chester and potentially see the little baby immediately. The new baby, though, is born to Mum Sariki. She's a 39-year-old Bornean orangutan with her. It's her 4th baby. What's particularly significant is that Bornean orangutans normally only have a baby about once every 7 years. It's the lowest interbirth interval of any of the apes. So it really is a landmark. And so actually it's its brother, who was the last time we had a birth, which is 7 years ago here at the zoo, Tomble. Yeah, it's a terrible litany of things actually that's gone on. I mean, firstly, the forest in Borneo is just disappearing. There is less of it left now. It's somewhere between 40 and 50% of it left. Certainly, when I was a boy, Borneo is one of the last untouched paradises. People thought of it as an entire island of forest and exploration. That's no longer the case. Also, orangutans live in lowland forests. That's forest near the coast. And much of the forest that's left is the most difficult forest to clear that's in the uplands, in the highlands, in the centre of Borneo. And that's cleared for a whole range of things that obviously we're strongly advocating people buy products with sustainable palm oil. That's been one of the major drivers of deforestation, but also forest fires. And as much as the habitat loss, it's the hunting. We cannot take more than 2,000 of these animals out of the forest a year and expect the population to survive more than the next few decades. If you're actually then killing and poaching, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 a year, that is literally centuries worth of babies that are just being taken in every single year. I think it'll be a fair few weeks before we, find out the sex of your baby, and she starts to build a bit of confidence. And then perhaps we'll come back to you when we name it, if you're interested.
Welcome back. We've got time for a quick chat with our panel to end the show. Andrew Marr, Melanie Phillips and Fraser Nelson are with me. You, Fraser and Andrew, are both former political editors of The Scotsman. And there's this rather interesting thing about the two contenders to lead Scotland are both of Asian origin. How'd that happen?
Hamza Yusuf and Anna Sarwar, they're both very interesting politicians. I think Anna Sarwar, if there was a sudden Labour leadership thing, he's not in the House of Commons and all the rest of it. For my money, he's one of the most talented of the younger generation of Labour politicians anywhere in the UK. Watch that man.
That's interesting.
Both from the same private school as well, Hutchison's Grammar, so you've got that dynamic going on. But it is, I think, Anna Sarwar, one of the biggest questions of the next election will be how will Scottish Labour do? Will they be able to, and we're going to see there's a by-election coming up in Scotland and Rutherglen as well, and that will tell us whether the SNP will falter after the Nicola Sturgeon recent drama, and if Labour can capitalise on it. If they can, that's 20, 25 seats for Labour. If not, things might be harder.
It's the door to Downing. Scotland is the door to Downing Street now.
Yes, I think we probably aren't still, as a kind of political class, paying enough attention to Scotland, because I agree with you.
Well, I was up there in the summer, and I have to say, virtually the entire Labour leadership spent their summer in Scotland. They've noticed.
Let's return to our earlier theme, which is, bluntly speaking, nothing works. Melanie, is this a problem for all political parties now? That actually, I think in your writing, what you've basically been saying, and echoing what Andrew said earlier on, that we are a country with the smallest economy that can't fulfil the promises that its politicians make. How do we get out of that bind?
Well, I think that's part of a problem that's across the Western world. But I think Britain, if you're focusing on Britain, I think there are particular problems. I think, first of all, this is chickens coming home to roost. My own view over the last 3 or 4 decades has been that the education system has been in a state of prospective meltdown. We've got it. We've got people who are not properly educated. That's the first thing. The second thing, and they're in the official class, the governing class. The second thing is that in that governing class, people have been appointed for the wrong reasons, for reasons of identity politics rather than competence. But I think that overall, I think the real problem is a kind of demoralisation. This idea that Britain is sort of adrift in the world, that it doesn't have power, that it doesn't have the capacity to do for itself. And it goes back to what you were saying about the rise of Asian families. The point about Asian families, And I think this is a really important reason why we're getting such high proportion in public life, is that they're coming from backgrounds which are fantastically ambitious for their children and push their children. Their children imbibe that kind of ambition. And the ambition is based on a self-confidence. They know what they are, they know what they want to be, they believe they can be. And what's gone wrong in Britain, I think in so many ways, is that Britain has lost that sense of what it could be, that sense of we can do this, and this sense of hopefulness. So we don't have politicians who give us a sense of hopefulness.
I'm going to ask all three of you, by the way, before we end, just to give me 15 seconds on who we should be watching in the next week. But Andrew, you wanted to come in on this issue.
Yeah, it's an anecdotal story, but I can remember a few years back, international flight, overnight flight, everybody is comatose in the plane. In the row in front of me, there's an Indian mother and father and two small kids with maths books. And every time they nod, they get whacked and they're back onto their maths books again. And I thought, there's the future, there's what's going to happen.
But just Rishi Sunak, who wants everybody to do maths to 18.
Neither of them was Rishi Sunak, so far as I can remember. But I was really struck by that. But just coming back to what you were saying about India, I mean, I think there's no doubt that we're going to become a more India-inflected and influenced country over the next 10 years. 1.4 billion people. If we do a big trade deal with them, which I think we will, that is going to be enormously influential. That means more Indians coming here, more Indians being able to take their pension pots back. But the crucial point for everyone to remember is this is not Congress India. This is BJP India. And it may not even be called India for very much longer.
India.
It may be Bharat, not India. We keep saying India, it may well be Bharat.
Fraser, who should we be keeping our eye on for the next week?
TUC conference starts today in Liverpool. I think the relationship between the unions and the Labour Party is very interesting. We're discussing earlier on today their critique about don't go back to 97. I think it's going to be, of course, the unions will have a massive get out the votes operation. How enthusiastically are they going to back Keir Starmer?
No?
Well, we're obviously going to have to look at the TUC conference. Frankly, I'd rather not. But I'm going to be looking at what politicians generally in the government are saying about China. Are they going to step up to the plate now, having had the latest of these shocks, or are they going to go back to being not really alert enough?
I can answer Melanie's question. No, they're not going to step up to the plate, so that's that done. Politicians, I would be looking for Angela Rayner at the TUC with her new role. What's her pitch going to be? And Yvette Cooper on the boats.
Okay. That's it for this weekend. Our second ever Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Thank you for joining us.